Welcome to the Story Learning Podcast, regular doses of language learning tips and motivation to help you become fluent in any language. With me, Olly Richards. For language programs, books, free resources, and much more, visit StoryLearning.com.
Hello, welcome back. This is episode 9 of the I Will Teach You a Language podcast. Thanks so much for listening. And just before I hit record today, I was over the river in Greenwich Market, which is here in London. It's a fantastic place where you've got all these food vendors from around the world selling all kinds of different food from Spain, Argentina, Afghanistan, Japan. And it was incredible, not just how much food there was there, but also how many different languages were being spoken. And it was just a kind of reminder to me that, especially if we live in a big city, all the people and all the languages that we need are often right here around us if we can just track them down. So without further ado, let's get to today's question, which is about different languages, and it comes from Nikki.
Hello, Ollie. I know a little rudimentary Turkish, about A1 level. I'm now learning Kurmanji, Kurdish. When I go to Turkey, I'm going to need to use both. They're both Turkic languages. Do you have any advice about how to keep them separate and not get the two confused?
Hi, Nikki. Thank you very much for leaving your question. So for the benefit of people at home, let's just talk about Turkish and Kurmanji and what they are. So they are languages from a similar geographical region. Kurmanji is otherwise known as Northern Kurdish. So if you think of the Kurdish, the area of Kurdistan, which is, so we're talking about places like Armenia, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran. It's one of the 3 Kurdish dialects that is spoken in this northern area. Turkish is also spoken in that area, obviously in Turkey, but Turkish comes from a different language family, and it actually comes from a language family called the Ural-Altaic family. Now, believe it or not, Turkish is actually one of the oldest languages that we know about, and this region where the Ural-Altaic family comes from is actually more like Mongolia and Korea and Japan, around what we currently know as the Far East. So you can trace the roots of Turkish back to there. So although within Turkey you're going to hear Turkish and Kurmanji, they actually come from different language families. And so what Nikki's talking about is an issue of confusing 2 languages which are fundamentally different, even though they're spoken in similar areas. And I think often when people ask about, how can I avoid confusing 2 languages? We've got these 2 different sets of situations. We've got the case when there are 2 languages from the same family, and then we've got this case, which is when you've got 2 separate languages. And the advice, I think, is slightly different. So today we're going to focus on how to avoid confusing 2 languages which are fundamentally separate. Now, let me give you a little analogy to see if this helps to understand the task that's facing you. Let's imagine that you're inviting some friends round for dinner, and you want to impress them with a couple of fancy desserts. So you're going to make a souffle, and you're going to make a baked Alaska. This is you might not know what this is, but this is a pretty cool dessert that I came across recently, which, like a souffle, also involves baking. So they're kind of similar, but they are kind of fundamentally different desserts as well. Now, if you were making both of these desserts for the first time, what's going to happen? You're most likely going to run into some problems because you've got 2 different things going on. You've literally got 2 different things in the oven, potentially even at the same time. You've got to obviously mix up the ingredients. You've got to time everything. You've got to bake them at the right temperature at the right time. You've got to take them out of the oven at the right time, and you've also got to serve them whilst they're hot so that they're ready for people to eat at the right time. So if you've got these two desserts that you have to do, and you're making them for the first time, what's going to happen? I think we all know what's going to be the outcome of this dinner party. You're going to do the best you can, but they're not going to be particularly successful. Now, let's imagine that the souffle, you've made it lots of times before. You're really familiar with it. You know the processes. You know how long it takes. You could probably do it even without the recipe. And just by following your gut, you're going to be able to get it, do it pretty well. So with the souffle taken care of, what happens to the baked Alaska? Well, suddenly you don't have to worry so much about the souffle, and you can turn all your attention to the baked Alaska, so that rather than kind of dividing your attention equally between the two, you can now concentrate on one, and you're much more likely to have a better result, even though this baked Alaska, you're making it for the first time. Now, if you've been able to bear with me that long, hopefully you can see the analogy. And the analogy is that it's exactly the same with languages. So with your Turkish and with your Kurmanji, you're facing essentially the same problem, which is that as you're at either beginner or fairly low level with both of these languages, a certain amount of confusion is inevitable, and there simply isn't a way round it. So, Nikki, if you're going to Turkey and you've really got your heart set on using these two languages together, then even if you're worried about confusion, then what I'd say to you is, well, just go for it. Go ahead and see what happens. Our brains are mysterious things, and it's impossible for anyone to say what you will or will not find and to what extent you'll get confused. So you should absolutely give it a go. But in terms of actually, kind of strategy and a good way forward, all of the established, experienced language learners that I know who have learned multiple languages will say the same thing, which is that the best way to cope with two languages, and the best way to cope with, especially with the confusion between two languages, is to focus on one and learn one of those languages well. Just like with our dessert analogy, once one of these languages is solid in your head and you're confident with it, that then allows you to focus on the other and just pay more attention to it, such that it doesn't confuse you so much. But it's when both of these languages are in the early beginner stages that you've just got nothing solid to latch onto, and so I think it's inevitable that you're going to get confused. Now, it's all very well for me to say this, but I wouldn't be surprised if you've still got this inner voice that kind of says to you, well, I want to learn both. I want to speak both. Why should I just restrict myself to one? And, this is something that we all struggle with all the time. It's, for the same reason that in any day, I would love to cook 3 meals, go to the gym, read a book, and all these things. And often, my problem is that by trying to do all of these things, I end up doing nothing. And so certainly in my life and in my language learning, I'm trying to keep that inner voice at bay and just focus down on one thing that I know is going to be most effective for me. So I would say, long term, and ideally you want to get both of these languages to a very high level. That's what we want, right? And so in order for that to happen, then the smart thing to do in the long term is to focus on one of those languages, get that to a good level where you're confident with it, and from there move to the other, and you'll find it a much easier and less stressful process. And remember, after all, even if you do choose to focus on, say, Turkish, well, the Kurmanji is not going anywhere, and it's still going to be there when you get back. So, Nikki, I hope that's helpful. As ever, there isn't one particularly easy solution to that, but I hope that gives you an idea of how you could approach the problem. Now, the region, the part of the world that we're talking about here is very interesting, and it can also be a little bit confusing geographically, because there is an awful lot going on. So what I've done is I've actually got a map of the north of Kurdistan, and I'm going to put it in the show notes, which are going to be at iwillteachyoualanguage.com/episode 9. So if you'd like to have a look at the region that we're talking about, then head over to the show notes and have a look, because it's very, very interesting. Now, if you've got a question that you'd like to ask me, then please do. Go over to iwillteachyoualanguage.com/ask, and there's a little widget there where you can leave me your language learning question that I'll answer on the podcast. As you know, if you've been listening to the episodes so far, and I've been accused of rambling a little bit, so I'm going to try and keep this concise, I'm giving away 3 free copies of my Language Learning Foundation's video course in order to celebrate the launch of the podcast. So if you'd like to win a copy, all you have to do is leave me a star rating and review on iTunes, and then I will pick 3 people at random across the world who will each win a copy of the course. But also, even if you're not interested in the course, if you'd like to show your support and to help me out, then I'd love it if you did leave me a review on iTunes. It really does help a lot for me to get the podcast featured in the rankings. Now, at the end of every episode, I like to give you a resource of some kind on the topic of the question of the day. So today I'm going to send you to a fantastic blog post from Benny Lewis of Fluent in 3 Months, who's written a great article. I think it's a few years old now, but it's just as relevant today as it ever was. and it's all about how to avoid mixing up different languages. Benny speaks a bunch of languages, more than me, and he has a lot of experience in having to keep them separate, obviously. So if you'd like to check out this post from Benny, if you're having trouble yourself avoiding mixing up languages, then have a look at that. I'm going to put the link in the show notes for you. iwillteachyoualanguage.com episode 9. / episode. Don't forget the /. iwillteachyoualanguage.com / episode 9 for the link to Benny's post and for everything else. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you in episode 10 of the podcast. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to today's episode, and in case you didn't already know, I teach languages in a rather unusual way through stories. Now, stories are a great way to learn a new language because when you're engrossed in a story, you remember things more easily, and the mechanics of the language just start clicking inside your brain. It's quite something, and if you'd like to find out how you can learn a new language or improve your skills in a language that you already know and do it with the power of stories, then you should check out my free Story Learning Kit, which will teach you exactly how this method works and how you can use it yourself to learn a new language. Visit storylearning.com /podkit, that's PODKIT, to get free access. Inside you'll find explanatory videos, masterclasses, worksheets, short stories to practice with, and much, much more. Once again, that is storylearning.com /podkit, PODKIT, and if you're lucky, you might also find a link in the podcast description or show notes of this episode.